Hello, everybody. So one of the things that I am most drawn to is brutalist web design. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it is oftentimes the antithesis of what we see for traditional web design. Everyone wants, most of the time for their website for it to be clear, for it to be functional, for the user to go in without having any questions that they can just navigate natively. And brutalism really throws a lot of that out the window. So a lot of what I'll be focusing on today is, are they actually throwing out all the rule books, or is it a deliberate breaking to create a specific type of user experience? So a little bit of what's in store is websites where you start to see a significant amount of overlapping modules, a lot of overlapping elements, ones that have poor contrast that become difficult to read. Of course, I'm not going to be tackling ADA compliance, but I'm sure a lot of these would not be falling in compliance. Websites like this that, let me see if it will, whoops, will it not let me open this up? All right, here we go. Websites such as this one. This was a former design company that has closed, but you see a very non-traditional horizontal scroll, a lot of elements that pop up, the ability for heavy interaction, and it's rather jarring and at times difficult to understand what it is that they are trying to communicate. So we'll be talking about some of those and why people would design websites like this. So they really kind of butt heads against, this idea of web design where it's intuitive, that it doesn't need instructions to figure out, that there is a lack of friction points. On most traditional websites, oh my God, my dog is snoring so loud. Ooh, sorry. Sorry about that, everyone. On most websites, what's clickable, how to move around and navigate through the website. So for instance, on a website such as this, you would hope that when you click the icon to submit your CV, when you click the text either above or below, that all of these things are fields that you can go to navigate throughout the site. Not as great websites, there's still some functionality. It just might not be as seamless as you're hoping. These ideas of good design focus on having, it be intuitive, that you're decreasing the cognitive load, that there's a minimal use of fonts, so that way there's a clear visual hierarchy. You're hoping that it's skim friendly. It should be answering several key questions. So when you get to the homepage, what is the site? What is it that, the service that they're selling, or the actual assets and tangible goods? What do they have here? What can you acquire? What can you do? Can you pay for services? Can you book sessions? Can you read reviews? Why should you be here and not somewhere else? The phrase that I both love and hate, the special sauce of the brand or the site. And where do you start? Where is the beginning of that user journey? Or if you're already through that user journey, where do you go next? Those are all things that traditional web design tries to do and tries to do well. But with brutalist design, it is very abrasive. It's incredibly raw. So it comes from the history of this architectural movement that came about in the 1950s. It rested very heavily on this utilitarian design with a lot of kind of raw materials such as concrete, so béton brut. So these are some concept pieces and some actual buildings that were constructed in this styling. For those that are local to the Western Mass area, HTC rests very heavily on that. If you look, most of the buildings actually don't come to any 90-degree angles, which makes a lot of the professor offices for office hours rather strange, with a lot of, kind of these acute angles and strange layouts. It's heavy, heavy concrete with a lot of steps and a lot of, exposed beams. A lot of this movement was focused on the idea of this utilitarian truth. So you're seeing what it is constructed of. There's not an attempt to hide posts or beams behind drywall or paint, that you're seeing the raw construction materials. So this is a picture of a current brutalist building that is right next to the IKEA in, where is it? In New Haven, Connecticut, which this one also has a very weird element of a completely floating floor that opens up and then bears the weight of the rest of the building. But you're seeing a lot of those square, gridded, modular things that really pays no mind to what they consider the frivolous frill of, what we consider beautiful, ornate designing. When this architectural movement gets transferred into web design, there's a few things that we start to see. In its purest sense, you have a few key markers that nothing is trying to hide itself. So hyperlinks and buttons respond to clicks, nothing else. There's not a lot of responsive elements. So you're not really seeing parallax. You're not seeing things that, images that maybe rotate or move as your mouse moves around the screen, which is what's becoming a growing trend. You're not seeing a lot of subtleties or, that kind of hover animation when you scroll over perhaps an icon. The buttons and hyperlinks look like buttons and hyperlinks. There's not really much to try to hide it. You view content by scrolling. You're not doing a kind of click through. You're just moving through the web page as you traditionally do. You're culling unrelated content. You're really removing almost all decoration. In its simplest iteration, we see websites like Craigslist, which are what an eyesore, but it's very clear what functions, what doesn't, how to click, how to move. So that would be kind of one of the purest forms of a brutalist website. This screenshot on the other side here also breaks it down and shows what we would consider in that vein. There's a very minimal use of color and a very minimal use of animation or frill. There's a few other pretty well-known sites. The Drudge Report, Craigslist has mentioned, Bloomberg, Reddit, especially the older Reddit before they kind of reskinned to make it more user-friendly. Things like the Drudge Report and Bloomberg, while those have a little bit more what we consider stylistic details, it's still very gridded, very modular, very clear where the hyperlinks are and how to navigate through. So those still fall very heavily within that kind of guiding principle. And I know what you might be saying, but Sage, you previewed a few sites in the beginning that were very garish, had a lot of noise, had a lot of color, had a lot of overlapping elements. And that's because brutalism, as most kind of cultural movements, start to evolve to include more things. So that kind of, while it's subjective, that ugliness of design has really kind of been taken and ran with by groups of designers who are starting to implement that more into their design. So it's starting to pull into other qualities as well outside of just that kind of rawness. So you're getting this postmodernism, minimalist design. Oftentimes it can be also retrospective or jarring or grungy. So you might see a lot of band websites looking like this. Retrospective as in it might have fonts that are not easy on the eye. It could be ones that are similar to a typewriter face that has, a heavy serif, but also looks old and rather difficult, or even elements or fonts that look kind of 8-bit back from the, earliest days of computers. So they're pulling in a lot of those elements. There's a lot of flat 2D elements. There's very little attempt for kind of a 3D beautiful layout. And one of the biggest markers is a seeming disregard for any idea of order, that they kind of throw that user into slight chaos. And then also continue to power through with a bold typography that isn't reserved just for headers, but oftentimes for the paragraphs as well, and strict modular grids. And so with kind of this such a wide breadth of ways that it kind of manifests itself, the unifying theme is that the design is oftentimes unpredictable. And for those who are using it, it's often rooted in this disillusionment with the growing hegemony of commercial sites and social media platforms. I mean, right now, if you look at almost any website, you can kind of predict how the layout is. All right, the culture that allows us to navigate websites seemingly without effort, in the same way that we drive through the roads, that I can drive in any state and know the stop signs are always going to be on the same side. They're always going to be the same color. They're always going to be the same shape. That suddenly, if you start making them blue, if you start moving them across to the other side of the street, that people miss them, that there's growing friction. In the same way that we have a culture for roads, we have a culture for behavior, a lot of websites utilize this culture. So most traditional websites, you're seeing the logo in the top corner that will bring you home, that you know what happens when you click it and where you'll go. You know exactly where it's going to be. I mean, almost every single commercial site now makes use of a big flashy, you know, main image. You've got the menu bar across the top, and then you start to go into call to action, paragraph, and you start to flow through. Almost every single website that I've seen lately has kind of looked like the wireframes are more copy and paste from each other. And while we have our own site variations and flares, most of the time good designers aren't trying to reinvent the wheel. Good designers are trying to make sure that users can function and move throughout the website by using a lot of this informal culture that's kind of taught us how to flag and how to move through. Brutalist design, on the other hand, really rallies against that and strongly hates those principles. This is one of my favorite websites. Let me exit out of this here so I can open it up. So this website, let's see, it was giving me some loading errors yesterday, but if I hit refresh enough, I'll get there. Here we go. So this website has seemingly no hierarchy. There is a bit of a very slight usage where you start to have at least the titles are highlighted, but the navigation and the layout, not really. I mean, the search bar is all the way down here, which isn't a particularly common thing. But there were a few elements that we're still pulling in. I mean, you're seeing buttons look like buttons. You know what happens when you know what is clickable. But then what happens, which I find actually rather delightful and kind of like a challenge, is as you click, everything rearranges itself and you have the option to exit out and move through. You know, you're seeing a lot of these grids, a lot of these kind of jarring layouts. And a seeming disregard of the culture of the internet that helps us navigate well, that helps me know that, okay, I'm looking for contact information. It should probably be up in this top corner or in the footer. And yeah, we have some function here, and that's actually newer since when they first made this website. But nope, the contact is here, which is a strange area, and where it pops up is kind of unpredictable. And so we're starting to see sites like that emerge through the brutalist movement. Let me pop this back up to full screen. There's another one, though, by the same token, that this is really jarring and dark and kind of falling into that kind of retrograde and grunge that I mentioned. You have other ones that are very sleek and very clean like this. This one is for a co-working space somewhere in Europe. But this is also a brutalist design. I mean, if you look back at what we talked about for sites like Craigslist, where we're talking about buttons look like buttons, it's clear, there's no frill, it's very intuitive, and you know, you're not hiding the elements. This also does this very well. Like, this is leaning on almost pure brutalism. You have 4 main buttons that you click to navigate through. You know, here might be a little more frill than we're typically used to seeing with brutalism, but it's incredibly clear. You can exit out of that and continue to move through and see who's already existing as people within this space. And it functions in the way that you would expect. It's very minimalist. It's very clear. You know, some of this would be a design frill where you see that kind of nice little animation and underlines, you know, so there is some area and some liberty that they're taking, but overall, I would absolutely say that this too fits in brutalism just as well as this does. And so you're seeing a lot of variation with the form. So moving back through, there's a few things to note here. While oftentimes brutalist sites can be a little jarring, there are a few elements that remain consistent. Oh, hold on, did my closed captions leave? I'm so sorry about that for anyone who has any sort of impairments that they need these for. Let me pop that back on. So one of the things to note here is brutalism is not anti-design. They're not trying to make it ugly for the sake of ugly. It doesn't want to feel contrived by any means, and it doesn't want to be a cookie cutter, but it's not purposely rebelling against everything in best practices. You know, it might be boasting harsh colors, but it's not trying to purposely make it an incredibly rough edge moment for the user. And so what do I mean by that? Here is one of the biggest differences. This is one of my favorite websites and social media accounts. It's how I check the weather, which is probably not the best way for me to check the weather. But this is from a Boston-based website called Weather is Happening. And it gives you the daily forecast for Boston. And their website is a lot. It is incredibly difficult to read. It is jarring. They, even with their text, I mean, look at this highlight here. It's absolutely horrific. They are using shorthand and slang, sometimes spelling things phonetically or purposely making it adjacent terminology. There is incredibly distracting and disorienting features on the back, both with the moving icons of this weather is happening, and this ugly little cyclone here, and the lightning bolts coming through. I mean, it is very, very difficult if you're trying to read through these links. I mean, it is near impossible. So this is anti-design. This is something that would not be considered in the same realm of brutalism. This is purposely trying to make the user frustrated and make information difficult to obtain. So let me see. Well, it looks like I'll have to start closed captioning every time. So a few people have said this and summarized it really well. So to quote here, in the ruggedness and lack of concern for comfort or ease, brutalism can easily be seen as a reaction by a younger generation to the lightness and optimism and the frivolity of today's web design. A lot of times these users are really trying to, or the creators and designers are really trying to make it less easy. And sometimes there is value in that. There can be extreme value in making your users actually have to think instead of mindlessly just plopping through your website. That sometimes those rough edge moments can really add a lot of beauty and clarity that can allow for a much more deliberate engagement with your brand. Another fantastic quote is the brutalist UX framework creates those rough edge moments that will make your users love you. It's a new type of experience based on neglect and on a user affinity caused by brutality. So there is some really fantastic quotes and discussions happening with game designers, for instance. So when you're looking at video games, you don't want it to be easy. You want a certain amount of challenge within that and the ability to navigate with some friction, because it gives you a task or a tool to an obstacle to overcome. It makes users have to engage. You have to think critically. There's a little bit of a challenge in trying to push through and engage with the content inside of the game. And there's a fine line that a lot of game designers talk about how difficult you can make it before it becomes actually frustrating. So you want it to be difficult, you want it to be engaging, you want there to be obstacles, but you don't want it to be at the point of extreme frustration. And brutalism straddles this very, very well, that it's making the users work for information in a way that hopefully brings delight. It brings a little bit of surprise and uniqueness to an experience that everywhere else on the web is just homogenous and too easy, too effortless. You know, it makes you work in a way that is hopefully worth the reward. And that's something that brutalist designers really need to find, that balance of making sure that, yes, it takes effort to move through, but that the reward of solving that or figuring out is always worth the frustration it takes to get there and the difficulty it takes to get there, that there should be, you know, relatively easy wins that are just slightly more difficult than normal. So here is another delightful, delightful website with a menu that is incredibly different than what we're used to seeing. So this is an e-commerce site that when you start to go through, oh, did they change it? I'm sorry, I've done this talk a few times. Oh my goodness, how could they do this to me? Well, let me show you based off of the screenshot that I have. Sorry about this. Not that I've run this talk a lot before, but I've, you know, hosted an archive of screenshots of rather delightful websites. So in their old menu layout, you could search by the time period that it was released in. So if you want something retro or not, by dragging these cursors to be kind of narrowing that range, you can look at, is it a limited release or is it a shop favorite? And then when you get into the materials here, I mean, we're not seeing the traditional menu bar that they have now that is a clean line across the top. Instead, what they have is they have, you know, the category for materials, and then you click the material that you're looking for. So you're looking for wood, great, you have this tree stump. You're looking for some sort of metal, okay, you have bars of gold. They even have for ceramics here a little nod to the Dada art movement, which is this urinal. So, which and I think the original inspiration was a piece called The Fountains, which is also one of my favorite art movements. So I think this is why this site has been particularly appealing. So yes, it's non-traditional. Yes, it really cuts against a lot of the intuition that we're used to seeing in websites. But what it does do and does really well is it's still intuitive. It's different, but I know what it means. I know what happens when I click on a piece of toilet paper. I'm getting to paper. I mean, maybe in times of crisis right now, I'd be hoping that it's actual toilet paper. But you know, let's say in a pre-coronavirus era, that toilet paper is pretty intuitive for just regular paper. So in some of those ways, the designer is having a lot of fun. That still kind of goes against some of that tradition. Here is another website, and these designers did actually change up their website quite a bit to make it more traditional. So we'll work off the screenshot here. You're seeing the menu in, you know, not the predominant place that we're used to seeing it, but it is on the sidebar, which isn't that out of the ordinary. But then what happens is as the user clicks through, they see something that really mirrors what you're used to seeing on a desktop. So it's not unfamiliar to the user, but it is unfamiliar in this application. And so as they would move through different sections, these grid areas for a work screen pop up, and the user is able to click and move them around the screen. And so sometimes elements would overlap. You know, when you would go to the contact page, it would have a contact form, but it would also be overlapped with a field of their information. And so you'd have to drag them out, separate them, and then you can fill it out. And so it feels very familiar to the experience you're used to having on your actual computer. But it's within a singular website, which is really novel and unique. It's in a singular tab. And so you're seeing overlapping elements. There's a little bit of work that needs to get done. And sometimes as you click through, backgrounds would change and some things would shift. You know, this click me in the corner would also make backgrounds rotate through. And eventually, you know, after 3 or 4, the user could get back to where they were trying to get. But it's easy. It's different. It's slight friction compared to what we're used to, but there's an element of delight of kind of pulling apart those elements that is a little fun. It's interactive in a way that's fresh. This website is also one of my favorites. It's very unique in how it's laid out. And this one, thank you for the people who haven't changed their websites so I can still use them. So it is in another language, but that's all right. Let's see here. So this is the menu page for a bar. They have their hours across the bottom. And while we're used to seeing hours, you know, shop hours in the footer, we're not used to seeing them sideways in this orientation. We're not used to the address being up in this top corner here. I mean, these are all very strange. And then when you return home or you're looking for social media, there's a bit of a hunting process that needs to happen to find that Facebook link. So there is some difficulty here for the user, but it's not a lot. The site is pretty bare bones. There's not an overwhelming amount of information, and they do make incredibly good use of white space. So it's not impossible for the user to navigate. That kind of hunting and searching for information is relatively minimal, and instead you get a very large payoff and delight when looking through this. And then you can click through and see the different drink options that they have listed underneath, where you get a lot of these kind of different fonts. There's no clear I mean, there is a hierarchy here, but there's not a consistency in the font use. You know, one of the elements that I had flagged earlier, you're seeing the drink options laid out underneath, these constantly shifting titles that make it very difficult to actually establish a theme. Yet it works. It works because you absolutely know what it is that they're selling and what it is that they're doing, even though these photos aren't quite relevant. And you know, we don't have to speak English to understand what this website is. So jumping back in here. You know, it kind of follows the, you know, some of these takeaways is it's following the clear minimum thing that we expect for a design. Some of the things that we've noticed with the other ones is that they're having a consistent color. It's very clear what's clickable and what's not. The fonts are sometimes limited, or sometimes they use a lot of different ones. But for example, with that last site that we saw, you know, the font choices are pretty consistent in some of these main texts. The sizing is a little erratic, but the only part that was changing, and changing pretty drastically into a very large font set, is across the top here. But overall, they're only breaking the rule a little bit. It's a very deliberate kind of friction point that they're implementing here. The color palettes have often been limited. While it's not true for all of them, it overall is relatively consistent. So here, this one we're seeing mostly the white, the yellow, black. This one, you know, the website is still holding true to kind of these erratic, colorful, bold background design elements, which I know isn't in line with traditional brutalism, but does fit into kind of the culture that has surrounded it now. This one, that's anti-design, so we won't even touch that. But so we are seeing some consistent themes that are starting to appear, that even though they're trying to cause friction and trying very deliberately, they're holding it back. They're showing some restraint. So I like to think of it as the art of controlled chaos. It's, you know, deliberate. There's a controlled lack of intuitive cuts. And what it helps it do is it really tears through the noise of modern web principles. And in that way, it can really stand out. That if I'm looking for bars near me, and I quickly want to see what drinks they have, or I'm looking for something that's going to be a good time. And as a lot of users do, they open up, you know, 5-10 tabs at a time, and they quickly look through to see what's there. This is a little different. I mean, that bar, if I landed on that web page, it would make me pause. You know, the other ones I could click through and just be, you know, done, done, done. And this is where I'd land. Oh, hold on. I'm getting some notifications here for comments. Oh boy, how do I get them back? Chat. All right. Let's see. So I have a question here. For most of these use black and white and some yellow. What is the power and problem with color? So not all brutalist web design rests very heavily on color. I mean, they try to strip back to this bare bones element that make it look rather older. They make it try to look simplified and kind of create or work to actively, you know, not create hierarchy, that there's a little bit more noise to dig through, that we're used to modern websites having maybe the titles are all in blue and then you can quickly jump through. Oh, yep, and I've got another question here. That they are trying to do a lot to make it slightly less easy. I mean, there is some, and let me see if I can find it again. Do I have it in here? I don't. But I have it elsewhere. Give me 1 second to open up one of my other windows here. Because there is an excellent website that uses a ton of color that I think would help illustrate kind of the variety maybe a little bit better than I did with my initial scope. Sorry, bear with me. Times like this, I am really grateful I actually organized my Google Drive recently. Here we go. I know you can't see my other window, but I promise I am pulling up a very fun website that uses color really heavily. All right, so let me bring this back in for you all. Here we go. So here's another example that really loves color. This is one that uses constantly different fonts, but they're using them even within the same words. But some of the things that they're doing well is if we're talking about breaking some elements and not others, they're, you know what's clickable. There's enough of a spacing between words that even as they trail off of the screen, oops, let me know. Didn't mean to click all the way through there. That even as they trail off and kind of clip and wrap around, you still know where those breaks are. I know that this says music, merch, and I know that it's Instagram, not Instagram. That even if, I mean, we know to recognize this word, but even if we didn't, if it was in another language, we have an idea where some of those breaks are. And what's clickable is still highly marked by this very simple contrast. I mean, you're looking at a very functional and simple website that's still somewhat intuitive, even if it's not used, even if it doesn't look like what we're used to seeing. And so this is one that actually uses a heavy use of a singular color. So let me jump back. I believe I had another question here. Yes. Okay. So if I recall, oh, am I clicking more things? I am sorry. I'm opening so many windows here. Some of them are more responsive than others. For this one in particular, yep, it is pretty scalable. So you are seeing a pretty, actually, I don't know if I'm scaling it on my side, but with the screen record kind of set to this window, I don't know if you're actually seeing that scaling. Talking about inclusive design, I have not done a full ADA audit of everything that is happening with all of these sites. I would say, I don't know if these would actually fit into a appropriate color contrast. I feel like slight tweaking would get them there. Like something like this, you should be able to make relatively inclusive by having the outlinks clearly labeled. You're looking at inline linkage here. The color might need slight tweaks, although it does look relatively high contrast. Some of them, so sites that like this, I would imagine would be far more difficult to do, but let's see. Ones like this, while it doesn't, if you're trying to look into fitting inclusivity, it's hitting the color contrast that we want to see. The font sizes look slightly a little too small to hit kind of the ideal view for for those with visual impairments that need kind of that larger kind of 16-point font. But you should be able to, I mean, I would still be able to navigate this pretty easily with my keyboard to be able to click through and select it. You're looking at inline linkage. You can still put the same amount of alt text with all of these if we're looking at ones that are more akin to this one. While this has overlapping elements, you should be able to, anyone who, it will take more work because you're going to want to have all of the area coding and labels to know exactly what it is that you're opening and still make sure that it is that on the back end of coding that there is a hierarchy that you move through as you're clicking through for keyboard only navigation, that you're still making sure to add alt text to all of your things, that you're going to need very clear the area labels here, aria. Always written it and never had to say it out loud, but you're still going to need to do that pretty heavily and more so on these sites than on others where it exists as a singular page. In terms of the depth that you can go, oh yeah, I agree that a lot of them do look like old punk with the forced exposure and that kind of grunginess. Yeah, that is a very astute comment. But some of them do go relatively deep. I mean, most of the sites that I've seen and that I've pulled from are mostly 5-10 page sites. But if you're looking at ones that kind of fit adjacent, they're a little more polished. I believe it is the Brooklyn Museum of Art has recently updated their look. And theirs actually looks relatively brutalist. I mean, you're seeing a lot of these kind of gridded elements in a way that isn't quite as clean of a line. I mean, these don't look like they're fully aligning into a unique grid. You're kind of seeing a centering instead of that left alignment that we're used to. The minimalist color palette, though, actually works really well as they're showcasing other art and art installations, that it's not competing with the color that you might have through different pieces. It does kind of go back into some more traditional grids here, but this is a really large website. I mean, this website has a significant amount of internal pages. See, this is more traditional. And as you get deeper down, a lot of them start to become more standardized. But those top landing pages, it's been a while since I've dug through this, but the top landing pages do kind of start to tease into a lot of that brutalist idea. It's more lightly influenced, but I think it does really pay tribute pretty well to that design and has a lot of that kind of heavy weighting. They are a little more conservative with its use, but I have seen some larger websites use it and use it in a heavy way. There's another one. What was it? There is a recording studio. It's Underground Records, Underground Labels. Let's see if it was this one. No. There is another one that I can add to the slide deck after the fact. I'll have to dig it up again. But there is a really, really fantastic, very well-known record company that has a pretty deep, an incredibly deep website, because they have, I think, 50 or 60 artists signed to them, and most of the slides have very similar layouts to each other. So you're not seeing a huge variety once you kind of get the gist of the website and you understand where that brutalist design is and how to navigate it, that it is incredibly consistent there. Once you navigate through, but that, you know, at least the shock value of the homepage and the shock value as when you start to land on those top pages is there, and it's pretty fantastic. Let me see. I want to open it up to Q&A, and I know your questions have already been coming through, but if there are more, feel free to send them. Let me see. And if you want to unmute your mic, I'm also open to if people want to talk, so you don't just hear my voice the whole time. Anyone?
I just sent a message, but I can ask it here. I was wondering how you find these sites. Like,
so a few of them I've pulled through from, I believe it's called Awards, yeah, with the triple W's, for these web awards. There's a few. So this site is fantastic, where they pull in, they're kind of top ranked for different versions of things. So it's a showcase of a lot of websites that fit certain themes. So my initial dive was looking at their Brutalist Awards, some of which I felt like were more brutalist leaning than others. There is another one. There is a couple of Tumblr blogs, I believe, that are also constantly showcasing brutalist designs. I mean, a lot of the ones on there are pretty steep range in production quality, because some of them are just underground artists, and that's where you start to see things that maybe are not paying as close of a mind to ADA compliance as they should. So some I like more than others. Some of them, when they are the underground artists, they are using images that they're then using, you know, things like Microsoft Paint to sketch out words and titles over the images. And I mean, maybe their alt text is really good. You know, a lot of the times I'm just viewing for my own pleasure and not going through with a full screen reader and everything like that for assistive devices. But there are a few in there that maybe as designers we should not necessarily be looking for, or looking towards, but there are a couple of professional ones that are hidden in there. And then a few are just, you know, as a creature that lives on the internet and probably especially now lives on the internet, as I'm sure we all are, there's a few that I keep a pretty stacked bookmark bar of websites that I find delightful, and a lot of them happen to fall into this. So for someone else, software for creating, oh, thank you for sending the best designs for in the group chat right now. There we go. Here's some. Thank you for finding that. Yeah, in terms of software for creating brutalist design, I mean, I've started to mirror my own personal website. You know, I think drag and drop sites tend to be a little more friendly for this sort of work. But right now, my personal website, I'm using Wix. I've made sure to comb through and make sure that the alt text is still good, that it's still incredibly easy to navigate with. You know, I still have hierarchy. I'm still using my header tags appropriately. Some of them I'm kind of playing against by having visually not your traditional headers, but still making sure that it's flagged as the appropriate one. Because here you can customize, not all of your H2s have to look together. You can completely customize it and still make sure it's read as an H2 or H3 or whatever you need. One of the things I've been playing with my own site is making sure that you know, I put my navigation on a non-traditional side. I have some kind of overlapping elements and kind of that gridded modular design that I've really tried to play with in a way that wasn't so burdensome to the user that they can still navigate. Um, I've, you know, made some areas a little more rough edge. So the quick links at the bottom by making it one continuous list. That is definitely not the easiest way to view or read this, and I'm definitely aware of that. But I've kept the list short. I've tried to counteract that in different ways. I haven't made as much of a hierarchy because I want some slight friction points. I want some of that to be in there, you know, and then I've pulled in other elements. So this would be considered more brutalist design with some of these gridded overlapping things. And I know this is not the only design movement that's utilizing it. And then still pulling in traditional stuff, still pulling in traditional work here that we're used to seeing, these nice accordion folders, things that aren't completely trying to destroy the user experience. And so I found Wix to be pretty good. If you are a custom coder, which is one of the few skills that I don't have, I'm sure you can find a lot of ways to kind of make some of those things appear on sides we're not used to seeing, that kind of get a little outside of that preset, you know, template box. I think the last slide that I hadn't shown here is on one of the about pages for Brutalism, they have this kind of mocking template that I think almost, I mean, it almost exactly mirrors every single website I've ever seen that, you know, I mean, outside of ones that are really paying for gorgeous designers, and outside of, I don't know why they make the menu here, but with menus across the top, I mean, how many of you have seen websites that look exactly like this layout? I mean, this could be a wireframe for so many places. And this is the exact type of things that they're trying to get away from. And so it might be worth looking at ways to add, you know, those small moments of delight. You know, thinking about and maybe even listening to some podcasts, for instance, that talk about video game design on how they balance and really, really well making things that are difficult for the users, but not impossible. You know, things that are a little bit of work to find, maybe even adding, if you want to start just an Easter egg in your website that brings someone to a cool hidden surprise page. There are some elements that you can start to tease in. I'm not saying everyone should use fonts that are like this, because this is not the nicest font going, but play around, play with some really, really heavy, you know, bold title elements that we might not be used to seeing, or simplifying down some of those navigations, and really figuring out how you can add some of that variety. Later, I'll go back through and find, I'm sure it is somewhere in my bookmark bar, that recording company, and I'll add that as a slide within these notes here. But there are a small amount of mainstream large websites that are using this design. Let's see, I believe it's Bloomberg.
Hi, Sage. You have about 3 or 4 minutes, and it looks like is a question that didn't get answered.
Okay,
The
let
Red
me pull up
Schoolhouse.
here. Let me see. Which one am I missing here? Hold on.
What software can I use to create a vlog with Brutalism?
Yes, so I don't do as much vlogging for like the live video streaming. I mean, so to clarify here, I cannot pronounce that handle. For vlogging and video, blog, yes. Okay, that's what I assumed you were talking about here, but yeah, so once again, I found Wix to be incredibly helpful in being able to really customize where a lot of those elements are. They are also, I mean, one of the problems with that as a host platform is sometimes the responsiveness of the design, especially as you're putting things in a non-hierarchical way, that if you have elements going down the side, but maybe other things counteracting, as you scale those sizes, it can be difficult on tablet viewing, for instance, but they will be and are currently in beta testing for a new redone Webflow that allows you to perfectly define all of those breakpoints. So Wix, I would say to keep your eye on if you want to do something along those lines. I've heard a lot of people suggest Webflow, which allows for a lot of design elements. You can integrate things like After Effects, Adobe After Effects, which can allow for even greater customization, animation. You can have some moving elements within there. Those two, I think, would be the easiest lifts if you're not a coder. If you are a coder, then depending on your skill set, the world is your oyster, I guess. But I definitely don't have the knowledge base for coding to answer that one. But yeah, if anyone wants to stay in contact, I mean, and this was the Bloomberg one I had mentioned that fits that. My contact information is here. Feel free to message me through my website. You can find me on social media, at Sage Orville. I'm happy to talk more. I am sorry for all of the ums, and it has been a long week. I'm sure for all of you, it has been a very long week, especially if you work in higher ed. Yeah, but feel free to reach out, and if you have cool websites that you've seen, I would love to add to my mountain of bookmarks, and I hope to hear some of your talks later on throughout the day.